Welcome to Behavior Grooves, the podcast that explores human behavior through a behavioral science lens. I'm Kurt.
And I'm Tim. We like to explore why we do what we do with researchers, authors, and practitioners in a conversational setting in order to bring those insights to you.
And today we're talking with a practitioner that we've been friends with for a few years. His name is Jonathan Mann, and we first met him when he moved to Minneapolis and joined Target Corporation to lead their user experience team. He saw that we hosted a meetup, and he was volunteering to share some behavioral insights with us.
Yeah, and in our first conversation with Jonathan, I was ecstatic to learn that he is an excellent amateur fingerstyle guitarist.
Oh, okay. Don't all guitar players use their fingers, Tim?
Well, yes. Okay, but the term fingerstyle refers to how you pluck the strings of the with your fingers of your right hand. It's some people use a pick, but fingerstyle means that you're plucking the strings with your right hand, and it's just more difficult than strumming.
Okay, I can't even strum, so I can only imagine, right? All right, so we wanted to talk with Jonathan about a presentation that he shared at Nudge It North. For those of you who weren't able to join us at Nudge It North, Jonathan's presentation was called Can You Design an Experience? And he used Jimi Hendrix's band, The Experience, as a metaphor.
Yeah, so we started talking with Jonathan about this idea of designing an experience and whether it's even possible to design an experience. So Jonathan offered up a definition of an experience that we can measure it by.
Jonathan said that an experience is really three parts. The first part is anticipation. Experiences are often things that we anticipate, and we sort of get ready for them even before the experience itself. The second part is the experience itself. And the third part is how we remember that experience.
Yeah, and all three of these combine to truly make an experience for us. So when Jonathan wondered if it's possible to actually design an experience, well, he was taking all those into consideration, and he basically said, no.
So we went on to discuss the parts of the experience that he could influence and how he worked with Robert Cialdini to come up with some interventions that really, really worked well. In fact, they worked so well, Jonathan started to wonder if they were even ethical.
Yeah, and it turned out that everything they were doing was completely above board, but it was really cool that he asked.
And we want to note that the music you're going to hear on this episode is played by Jonathan. We hope you enjoy it while you sit back and relax with a 6-string experience. Enjoy our conversation with Jonathan Mann.
Jonathan Mann, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to be back, and we're glad you're in studio this time. Well, virtual studio.
Virtual studio.
But last time we had you on, but you were presenting at one of our meetups, and we took that recording. So this is an actual time where we get to ask you questions, and you get to seal the whole experience of a Behavioral Grooves podcast. How about that?
I am super excited.
Yeah, I can tell.
You can tell with that. So let's start with that experience with our famous speed round. All right, Tim,
yeah.
do you want to go?
Sure. Jonathan, coffee or tea?
Both.
Both. Is it time of day of the
Coffee in
week?
the morning, tea for lunch.
Wow. Okay.
Hey, Tim, I'm going to throw you for a loop. I'm going to ask 3, so you can ask 2. All right, when we go back here. So, Jonathan, what was your first outside the home paid job?
I was a paper boy starting at about age 9.
Wow. A morning paper or an afternoon paper?
Yeah, after school on the weekdays, and then the morning, Sunday morning.
Sunday morning. Oh, those are early mornings for kids on those days. My friend had one, and I would help him out every once in a while, and I would never do the Sunday morning. It was too hard.
I would never do that job anyway.
Thinking back on it, having kids do that job, I remember I used to have to, like, every week go door to door to collect cash money from my customers.
Wow.
So this kid was knocking on doors in the evening. I don't know if they would have people do that.
Yeah. Okay. Next speed round question. Which do you prefer, E major or E minor?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess it just depends on the mood. If I'm feeling bluesy, it's the minor. If I'm feeling country, it's the major.
Fantastic. We'll come back to that later.
All right. Is it possible for user experience designers to actually design an experience for a user?
I am glad you asked. Because the answer is not really. And
Okay.
we'll talk about that more.
Yeah, so this was you spoke at Nudge It North, and this was the topic of your discussion, is this idea of, can designers design an experience? And so what got you thinking about this topic? What was the impetus for you to go,
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been thinking about this for many years, and this was actually a gratifying presentation for me to give because I've been thinking about it for a number of years, and I couldn't figure out exactly how to get these thoughts out of my mind. But I've been a user experience designer / user experience leader for many, many years. 15 or so years, and it struck me that we have this thing in our title, user experience designer, and there are other experience designers. There's customer experience and enterprise experience, et cetera. But we all have this thing in our title, experience designers. And I'm like, is that something you can really do? And one of the things that I did at one point was I asked a bunch of people on my team, what is experience? Like, what is the word experience? We have this thing in our title, experience designer. Like, what is this thing that we're supposedly designing? And a couple of the answers I got were, an experience is something you go through. It's a process or an event. Another person said it's a collection of impressions that are taken in by your senses as you move through time. Another person said it's a series of events that a person has put through that can lead to a feeling that's either positive or negative. So, and I have 10 or a dozen of these. And so, as you could tell, it's interesting because there's not really a common definition of experience if you ask a whole bunch of people that. And I'm like, well, that's interesting.
Well, these aren't just random people. These are people on your team, right?
Exactly.
These are people that are actually doing the work of designing user experiences.
Right, exactly. And so it was striking to me that we supposedly have this job, and unlike an interior designer, for example, like the kind of a good definition of what that is, but an experience designer. And then if you think about some of these definitions, one thing that they do have in common, some of those ones that I just rattled through, is they're talking about this internal feeling that you have. And if you think about it more, like, can you design something that is going to be the way somebody reacts internally? And in my opinion, and we could talk about the reason I feel this way, in my opinion, the answer is no. What you can do is you can design the potential for an experience. And, theoretically, what you're trying to do is not just design an experience, but, hopefully a good experience. So you can design the potential for that, but you can't design the experience itself, because that is something that's, it's experienced by, it's an internal thing. It's not an external thing that you can design, like whatever, like a product. You can design the product and there it is, but you can't design the actual experience.
So go talk a little bit more about the internal nature of that. Like, why is it that you don't think we can have the internal experience designed for that? Help expand that.
Yeah, sure. So, as you guys know, because I've talked to you about it and I attend your wonderful meetups, we as human beings have irrational minds, right? Like we don't all perceive the world the same way, and we don't always perceive the world as, you would expect it to happen. And Dan Gilbert wrote a great book, Stumbling on Happiness, which is, it was a best-selling book. And I stole one of his quotes in my presentation, which I don't know if these are the exact words, but it's something like, we misperceive the present, we misremember the past, and there's one other one to it, which sorry,
we'll look it up.
We can look it up, but essentially what he's saying is that And this is one of the foundations for my thinking around it, is that you're in the present moment, and we as human beings will misperceive like what's right in front of us. So that's one of the reasons that it's difficult to impossible to design an experience, because you're going to misperceive it. And then another quality of an experience is your memory of that experience. And one of the important things about that is that we don't always remember things the way they actually were. So if the fact that we're misremembering it means that this experience that we supposedly have, you're not going to remember it just like, like a movie that was in front of you. It's going to vary over time. And then similarly, your expectations about it, you're going to think about the future, and it's not going to be exactly how you anticipate it. So all of those things conspire to make it difficult to impossible to design something predictably that somebody's going to experience and remember the way you want it to happen.
So what is your job then? If you have this title, yep, leading a group of people who are supposed to be user experience designers, what are you actually trying to do?
So like I said earlier, what we really are trying to do is increase the potential for a good experience. And so maybe that's splitting hairs with some people. And indeed, I myself just continue to call ourselves experience designers, but if you were to really make our job title accurate, we would be called, I guess it would be potential user experience.
Right.
PUX, PUX or something.
Yeah. Not UX, not EX, not CX. No, it would be PUX. Yeah. I think that's a pretty great way of thinking about it. The something that you brought up here is that we have these misperceptions, past, present, and future, and yet you're tasking your team with trying to create the potential for something. How are you going about that? What do you think are the best practices around trying to guide and create that potential user experience?
Well, let me like back up just a little bit before I answer that directly. So one of the concepts that I learned as I researched this topic quite a bit was it's a fallacy to think about an experience as being just the present moment. Like, the three of us are having an experience right now, and we're in the present moment right now. But our totality of this experience needs to be thought of as both as the anticipation of it. So we're thinking about it, and we're having thoughts and fears and whatever about the experience we're about to have. Then we're having the experience itself, and then we're going to have a memory of the experience. And I believe that the experience is a conglomeration of all of those three things. So it's the anticipation, it's the experience itself, and it's the memory. And the most important part of it as an experience designer or potential user experience designer is to focus on having a good memory of the experience, because that's what you're going to take away. And if you think about doing things like driving engagement and hoping that people will come back to experience it again, you mostly want them to have a good memory of the experience. So that would be skipping to the end. That would be my advice, for thinking about, being a great potential user experience designer, is to focus on the memory.
Yeah, cool.
Which is different than focusing in on that present moment. And we've talked about this in the past, but there's this idea, and I use this example of going camping, right? You anticipate, you plan for your camping trip, you get excited about it, you're getting all your gear ready, kind of anticipating this wonderful camping experience, hiking, canoeing, whatever it is that you're doing. And then you actually have the experience. And the experience can be wonderful, or it could be rainy and cold and miserable during that time, right?
Yep.
But then you remember afterwards, and the memory doesn't necessarily always correlate to the actual experience. That memory of, I will recall this for the rest of my life, is we went to the Boundary Waters with my family, and it rained. It was literally, we canoed to the campsite. We were setting up our tents quickly because it started to sprinkle. And then luckily we got the tents up, and it rained pretty much the entire time until we left 3 days later. Right. But it was wonderful in memory, because we sat around the campfire, we read Harry Potter out loud, we did all of these things. In the moment, I'm sure we were miserable. It was cold. It was, but what we remember are those moments that we take out. And so it's a very different experience of that you have. So you can take a horrible experience, and actually the memory of it can be good. So I now ask you, you're not trying to create horrible experiences that have good memories, right? But you're trying to look at that memory, or the remembered part of this more than just the experience part. Is that what I take away?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, of course, you want to, design the present moment that the person's going to go through to be as good as possible, or potentially as good as possible. And, there are heuristics and best practices for that, and user experience designers are great at that, and making things usable and easy to understand, et cetera. But it's important for experience designers to keep in mind that what you think people are going to experience may not be that exact thing. And then to your point, Kurt, they may remember it very differently than they actually experienced it. And you gave a good example, and that's indeed very true. And that was actually one of the things that that I learned from one of my articles, which I think you guys are going to give a reference in your notes, was that anticipation often drives memory. So, in your Boundary Waters example, you likely had like this amazing anticipation of a great experience. Then you didn't have the greatest experience, but you remembered it similarly to your anticipation. And that's a common human trait. And the example I give in my presentation is of a wedding. So same thing as what you described. Like, you'll imagine your wedding, you'll anticipate your wedding to be this wonderful thing where it's a beautiful spring day and everybody's smiling, and the flowers are perfect and the food is perfect and everybody has a wonderful time. But what really happens is, your Uncle Fred takes too much prime rib, and, cake falls over, and, somebody's phone rings during the ceremony, or, all those things happen. But your memory will probably revert to something closer to what you anticipated, just like what you described.
Yeah. I wanted to roll back the pages a few years. You've been doing user experience work for many years. You worked with Target, you worked with PayPal, and you actually did some research with Robert Cialdini. Yep. And I've got two questions along these lines, Jonathan. One is, what got you interested in applying behavioral science to your work? And then how did you get connected with this this ASU god of research?
Yeah. Well, that's one of my favorite stories, because that's what got me into behavioral design in the first place. So, this was when I was at PayPal. We were looking. I won't go too deep into it, but we were looking to drive a certain behavior for how people would use their PayPal account, and we were getting very frustrated because me and my team, we did a great job, not to toot our own horns, but we did a great job at designing the flow to do this to be as easy as possible. And indeed, that did drive quite a bit of conversion, conversion being, people that completed this flow. But just to state the obvious, you can't complete a flow, you can't complete a task if you don't start it. And we were struggling, so once somebody started the task, we had a lot of success in getting more of them to finish it. But what we didn't do was get people to start the task in the first place. And you can't do that through user experience design. That's a behavioral nudge. And we tried all sorts of things, the marketing team and I, to try to get people to take that step. And what we were doing, as you guys very well know, we were doing we were doing system 2 design. We were giving people a lot of facts and hoping that those facts would drive their behavior. And we just tried all these experiments, these A/B tests, multivariate tests, and none of them worked because we kept throwing facts at people, and people were just like, whatever, I'm going to go my merry way because your facts are not compelling. And so then I read this article by Cialdini, his famous towel experiment that he did in a Phoenix hotel. And I'm assuming you don't want me to go too deep into that.
I think, for people, it was basically saying, look, it was pure looking at peer norms and saying, hey, people in this hotel room reuse their towels 70% and you got a much higher use of reusing those towels than you did if it was just a general reuse, or if you use some other messaging like how good this is for the environment, etc. So
right, exactly. And I stumbled across that article, and when I read it, I had this weird revelation. Is like, this is, first of all, it's fascinating, but moreover, this is kind of like what we're trying to do at PayPal, because we're trying to get people to do this a little bit of extra work, in this case, like hang their towel back up instead of dropping it on the floor. And on the surface, it's good for the business, right? Like, the hotels want you to reuse your towel ostensibly for environmental reasons, but they also probably save money because it's less laundering costs, et cetera, less work for their staff. Similarly, this behavior that we wanted for PayPal was also good for the user, but it was also good for PayPal. And so I just made this weird connection as like this towel thing is kind of similar to what we wanted to do at PayPal. And at the time I was living in Arizona, and, as you noted, Cialdini is from Arizona State University. So I just kind of looked him up. Like I stalked him on the web, and I found his email, and I sent him an email. I'm like, hey, I got this thing I want to do. I'm with PayPal, and, I'd like to do an experiment and talk to you about your towel thing and see if we can do that at PayPal. And to my surprise and delight, he wrote me back, the next day, and I took him to lunch and we talked about it. And I didn't work directly with him. I worked with one of his associates, and we put together some verbiage, primarily using his social proof concept, but also using a bit of authority too. And long story short it was wildly successful and drove millions of dollars in profit. And that made me a believer.
Wow. So would it be fair to say you were skeptical in advance of that?
I don't know about skeptical, because, I obviously initiated it and I saw the success that he had with the towel thing, but I can tell you that certainly my coworkers were super skeptical. And I was actually really amazed by the results. And one of the things that was really amazing was not only did it drive the behavior right away, but the behavior stuck with people longer term. So like it was this kind of seeding of this information. It got people to do the behavior, but it got them, like if you looked at them longitudinally, it got them to stick with the behavior longer term as compared to people that didn't see that message. So I thought that was fascinating also and unexpected.
Yeah. So Jonathan, you've been using then behavioral science as part of your repertoire as a potential user designer, experience designer, right? So when you're thinking about this new concept that you have, right, of looking at, we really need to be thinking about the memory aspect of it. Are there any any behavioral science principles that you are finding work better in this area? Is this something you're still exploring? What are you finding in that area?
It's something I'm still exploring. In the talk that I gave a few tips for that. One is probably very well known to people, and indeed I think it has become more of the repertoire of experienced designers, which is the peak end rule. So ending with a bang, ending with an awesome experience can often make up for fair to middling experience beforehand, and usually has the effect of a good memory of the experience. So like thinking of your boundary waters, like even if it was raining the whole time, if towards the end the sun came out and you caught a fish or something, like that would make the entire experience seem great in your memory.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else? Yeah. If you could keep going, that'd be great. Continue to share these tips.
Sure. So another, which I thought was interesting, is to add uncertainty, which is sort of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But there have been a few experiments around this, and one, for example, is like thinking about like a secret admirer, right? If you get like a note from saying like, oh, I think you're pretty cute, and it says a secret admirer, that gives you more like long-lasting kind of happiness and pleasure than if the person like reveals themselves to you. So there's like what happens according to these studies is like people tend to keep thinking about them and remember them more positively because they're thought of as rare and unusual. And there's this little unfinished business that keeps things circulating in your mind. So having a bit of uncertainty can sometimes drive a positive experience and a memory of that too.
Yeah, that's almost like the Zygarnik effect, which is that the unfinished part, right? So this idea of, Hemingway would always famously end his writing sessions mid-sentence because he didn't finish that. And so then overnight, his brain is working on how are we completing that sentence. And there's lots of research that points to unfinished things get more processing in our subconscious and various different aspects of that. So it sounds like this uncertainty aspect, the secret admirer piece, is your brain is trying to figure out what is going on and actually continuing to process that more so than they would if it was, oh, it's Jane or it's Tom or whoever it would be. That's final. I get it. I know I make an opinion of it, but secret admirer could be Tom, could be Jane, could be, Brad Pitt for all we know. Who knows, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
What else? What other tips do you want to share with us?
So another thing that I came across, which I found was fascinating, was this isn't necessarily to drive a good memory, but it's just to drive the memory in and of itself. Was to avoid asking people to explain the experience afterwards. And so there was a fascinating study where, those kind of paint chips that you get at the paint store. So people were shown whatever it is, let's say yellow, they were shown a shade of yellow. And then they were asked to pick that shade of yellow from a scattering of paint chips that were in front of them. And those who were first asked to describe that yellow, whatever, it's light or dark or mustardy or whatever, did worse than those who were not asked to describe it. So somehow the act of describing it could somehow overwrite the experience itself. So as you're describing this thing, which we've already talked about, is a bit ephemeral and often misperceived, you will sometimes write in your brain the wrong memory. And then, as you're describing it, it becomes implanted as the wrong memory.
Wow. That's another interesting fact. Like you think about when you want people to go back and to rethink about that and to reframe that. But to your point, right, that it overrides. And if it's wrong and if it's in the negative perspective, that's a bad thing to happen. Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
there was some work in Germany a bunch of years ago when researchers asked married couples to reflect individually. They gave one group the task of list 15 things that you absolutely adore about your partner, and they gave another group list 3 things that you absolutely adore about your partner, and then they had another group. They said list 15 things that you absolutely hate about your partner. And then another group was list 3 things that you absolutely hate about your partner. And the people who were tasked with listing 15 positive things had a higher divorce rate than those who only had to list 3 things, because they got to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and they really felt like, wow, I don't have 15 really great things to say about my partner. Maybe I shouldn't be married. And the ones who actually listed 15 things that they really hate were like, well, this is just life. So it had a weird effect of tasking people with things that should be positive, ended up actually having, to reflect back and to have these memories, actually had a counterintuitive effect. So I think that this is a really astute thing that you've integrated into this list, Jonathan. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and this is me just totally making this up, as you're talking. But I wonder if, like, kind of related to what you were saying, I wonder if describing the experience can somehow like mitigate what we talked about with the peak end rule, right? Like if you experience the peak end rule and you just let it fly, then people are going to have this wonderful memory of their experience, which, may or may not have been uniformly wonderful. But if you're asked to go back and think about it, then, oh yeah, I remember it was actually raining, and I remember I was actually getting eaten up by mosquitoes, and then it becomes not so great. And the act of having you describe it was probably
reinforcing the more accurate view of those of my trip. Right, this idea that if I would have had to write a little essay about the trip immediately following that camping trip, might have implanted more of the actual negative aspects in my brain, as opposed to letting some time pass where all of a sudden what I remember is just that, hey, yeah, it was sunny when we left, and it was, nice. And I could remember those the peak parts, as you said, the reading of Harry Potter and doing those types of things. So again, counterintuitive. And that's, I think, what the real interesting piece here is that, and what I think behavioral science points out, and this is why it's so fascinating for Tim and me to talk to people about this, because you would assume, you would make assumptions on a number of these things, and yet the way that our brain operates and the way that we then behave subsequently is not always the way that you make that assumption up front. And so this is why I think behavioral science is so fascinating.
And why I'm so glad that you are integrating behavioral science into your work. I think that it's really important for the kind of work that you're doing has a huge impact on lots and lots of people, right? Because when you're designing products, you're influencing, well, in PayPal's experience, millions of people, right? With Target, millions of people. And it's really great that you care about it in this regard, and I also know this about you, is that you have a very ethical approach to the application of behavioral science as well. But maybe you could talk about that. You've got this very powerful wand with behavioral science to do good or evil, but you continue to choose to do good.
I hope I do. Yeah, it was interesting when you had talked about that meeting that I had with Robert Cialdini. I asked him that very question, and as you guys well know, I didn't know this at the time, but as you guys well know, he thinks about ethics quite a bit. Mm-hmm. In his latest book, he devoted several chapters to that. So when we talked about the concept of what we were going to do, I asked him that, is like, is this ethical if we kind of nudge people, using this dark magic that, you've written about? And he didn't hesitate in answering, because, he's obviously thought about it quite a bit. And, he said a lot of things, but in general, what one of the key things that he said is that if it's true, it's likely ethical. So, thinking about social proof, if you tell somebody that, millions of other people like you have done this thing, and that's a true statement, then there's probably no ethical violation going on there. And in fact, it's probably useful information for you, because like if you're worried about taking this step and you see, well, tens of millions of people like me did this thing, and I haven't heard about some calamity to those tens of millions of people, then that's probably useful information to you. But I'm sure you guys have seen this too. There's often the unethical application of that, where tens of millions of people really didn't do that. Like maybe 10 people did that, and that's giving false information, and that's an obvious ethical violation.
Yeah, that's why we don't tell the 10 million listeners that we have about the 10 million listeners that we have.
There you go.
or maybe bad. The 10. I don't know. That might be part of it. So
right. And then there's other things to think about also. As there's sort of the golden rule where you're doing this thing. If you step back, would you be okay if you knew that somebody did it to you, if somebody nudged this behavior? And then, thinking about the behavior itself, is it at least neutral to good? Like, if somebody takes this step that you're trying to nudge them for, is it in their best interest, really in their best interest, not, your best interest, and you're kind of making excuses.
Wink, wink.
Yeah, exactly. So I think some of those high level questions are important to ask yourself, and maybe bring in, an unpartial person to kind of look at it also, so that you're not giving into your own biases.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting part there, that idea of bringing somebody from the outside in, because we do get wrapped up. We get wrapped up in, we're thinking that this is good. Tim and I talked about, the people that end up doing some of the most unethical things within organizations are the ones that have the strongest connection to that organization. And because then that colors everything that they do. And so they look past some of these just, tiny things or larger things, because it's in the good of the company, and they don't always think about that. So bringing in that outside perspective, I think, is really wonderful for that.
Agreed.
I was wondering if we could switch over and talk a little bit about your musical life, because I know that you are a fine fingerstyle guitarist. You've released a record. You've got a YouTube channel, and you have my admiration and envy at times in listening to your recordings, because you really got great technique. But what, just out of curiosity, what's on your playlist these days? It's COVID times, and you're, decamped with your family in a pretty quarantined environment. What are you listening to?
What am I listening to? That's a good question. So I have a 15-year-old son who, I'll brag about and say is a better musician than me, and a fantastic composer. And I'm happy to see also has, in my opinion, great taste in music. You kind of worried about, pop stuff or whatever that might get played in the house, but he actually has awesome taste. So he's been playing a lot of stuff. Interestingly, even though he's only 15, he's really into 90s rock, which I hadn't listened to, frankly, since the 90s. So it's kind of nice. We've got like Green Day and Stone Temple Pilot and, all these 90s bands cranking in the background. And then the two of us actually get together and record some of that stuff together, which is a real delight for me.
That's really cool. The ability to actually, record with your 15-year-old. My 14-year-old and me, I'm just sitting there going, yeah, that would never work. Because neither of us have. Well, actually, Quinn he's pretty good. He's been taking piano for a number of years, and he's pretty good. And it's fun when you just listen to him just kind of play, not doing any music, but kind of just composing on the fly, and he does a really good job there. But yeah, I don't have any musical talent, but even if we did, our musical tastes are so widely different that we would never be able to combine. So that's nice.
And then otherwise, you mentioned I play acoustic fingerstyle guitar, so I'm always listening to some of my heroes in that genre. One of whom,
I was going to say, which include who? There's probably a long list.
Local Minnesotan, who's one of the trailblazers in the field, which is Leo Kottke. So I'm always listening to Leo now and again, and he's I can't remember what part of Minnesota he's from, but he's one of our local talents. But then there's great people like Tommy Emmanuel, who I saw. That was actually my last live concert that I went to before COVID, that I saw over at the Dakota, who's amazing guitar player. But there's dozens of others that.
Yeah, Tommy Emmanuel just seems to be a guy who can just play anything. He kills me that any task in front of him, any fingerstyle task, come up with this or that or any style, country, rock, blues, jazz, he just bounces between them so effortlessly. And I think somebody should trip him and push him down the stairs, because he's just too damn good.
He sounds like fire. Playing all at once. And the magic that he and all of these great fingerstyle guitar players have is the ability to somehow separate what your thumb and your fingers do from each other. So you can play rhythm with your thumb and play something completely different with your fingers, which I can kind of do sometimes if I'm not thinking too hard about it. But like the level to which they are able to make that separation, it just gives me a headache. I can't do it nearly to that level. It's just amazing to me.
All right. A question from a non-musician here. When we asked in the speed round the difference between, do you prefer an E major or an E minor? And you went in and you described an E minor for the blues, but an E major for country. So help a non-musician understand why the major chord for the country and why the minor chord for the blues kind of focus there.
Well, blues, there's many aspects to blues, but one of them is this kind of flat third, which is this sad kind of resonant. I don't know, Tim, help me out. Like, there's this
sad, yeah.
I mean, the minor key is sad, emotional, and one of the aspects of blues is to play like those flatted thirds and those other kind of not dissonant notes, but these just kind of notes that just give you that feeling of emotion. I don't know. I'm not articulating this well.
well, I mean, as an example, like if you listen to "Sunshine of Your Love," Eric Clapton, right? That lick emphasizes that flatted third. That's a way of really emphasizing the angst in the message.
Can I show you instead of tell you?
Sure.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Let's do that.
Let's have a live performance here. This sounds great.
This happens to be in D. So this is a D major. And if you think about the more country and, that sort of major happy thing, it would be something like.
I'll fly away.
I want to slap my thigh and just get going with that. Yeah.
Yep. But then if you think about, so this is the same key, but if you play it bluesy, you would do something like with like a flatted third, which would be.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yes.
So you can hear the difference, both in the same key, but very different feels. And it's really just, the notes you play on the scale, the feeling that you give to it. But in general, the minor is the more bluesy, the major is the more country, happy, upbeat thing.
Thank you for that. See, Tim can talk about that for months on end, and I, the demonstration just made it very clear for me. So thank you.
Best ever, Jonathan. Thank you. That's fantastic. And with that, we want to thank you so very much for being a great guest and for sharing your user experience and non-user experience and potential user experience tips with us, our listeners today. We really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I groove on what we learn with our discussion with Jonathan, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our fumbling finger brains.
Fumbling fingers. He does not have fumbling fingers.
No, we have fumbling brains.
Okay.
Okay. You probably don't. I do. I just am amazed that you guys can actually do one thing with your left hand, another thing with your right hand, and it all makes beautiful music in the end. Because
it's kind of amazing to me too. Really, and drummers are even more amazing for that matter because
they are.
Yeah, man, that's just pretty phenomenal. I mean, that's really independent motion when you've got both feet doing different things and both hands doing different things. That's like mind bending. But
it's all just, and it's all crazy to me. So,
but speaking of experiences and not drummers, so how about if we start grooving with the question of what is an experience and can we design it?
Well, the experience is it's a band. It was formed by Jimi Hendrix back in the 60s.
Pretty phenomenal band too.
Yeah, it was. I even know them. So there you go. Yeah. No, so what was interesting for me on this was this idea, the concept that Jonathan brings up about that the experience is more than just the experience. That an actual experience includes the anticipatory aspect of it, what we think is going to happen, how we get excited about it, how we envision it taking place, all of those types of things, and then the remembered part of that experience as well. Right. And we've talked about this in the past on the show in regards to vacations, right? You have a vacation which, if you were designing it, the experience that we typically think about designing is the vacation itself, that week that you're going down to the Bahamas or to the cabin or wherever it is. But in reality, that vacation has those three parts as well. It's the anticipation of what is going to happen on the vacation, thinking through what all that looks like and getting excited about it. It's actually going on the vacation and doing whatever it is that you do. But then it's also this remembered aspect. What do you remember? And we talked about it from the perspective of going camping and all of the factors that we've had in those, where sometimes the experience itself is actually pretty crappy, but the remembered part, it actually takes on a whole different perspective and is actually pretty good, even though it rained or was cold or whatever else was going on.
Yeah, that is particularly interesting because using your camping experience, you anticipated it, you planned it, you looked forward to it. You in the middle of the experience itself, it rained and was kind of crappy for everybody to be stuck in the rain for those days. But then the memory is such an interesting and fragile thing, right? That wasn't a video replay of what happened. It was sort of a selective view of how much fun it was to sit in the tent and read Harry Potter to the kids. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So no one could have designed that experience for you, right? No one could have, in its totality. And I love Jonathan's definition that it is the combination of these three things. No one could have designed that in the way that it happened,
right?
But there are certain things that user experience designers can certainly influence. I think, right? We've talked about the way when you're in a wine shop and German music is playing, more German wine gets sold. So the experience is that more people are sort of open to, even if unconsciously, to buying German wine. And if French wine's played, then more French wine gets sold. So there is some aspect of the experience that is influencing us.
That you're influencing, right? So that the designer, that by playing the German music, you're influencing that experience of the purchase of the German wine versus the French wine. If you had designed the French music going on, and I think
in general, right? Not universally, but in general.
No, you can't necessarily design the anticipatory component of it or the remembered component of that particular example. But this is the piece that I think designers really need to understand. Whether you're a UX designer or whether you're just designing a corporate initiative or whether you're designing the dinner that you are trying to woo, a potential, love interest in, right? There is an anticipatory component that you set the stage. And so by setting the stage, you have to figure out how to set that stage appropriately in order to create the best experience possible. But you also have to think about what it is that is going to be remembered from this. And this is, again, taking some of the behavioral science principles that we talk about, the peak end rule. How are you ending the experience? What is that peak emotional moment that is going to be inside of this? How are you framing pieces? How are you getting people? Are you reminding people of the experience through reminders or various different pieces? So all of those factors come in, and that I think is a really key piece of what Jonathan is bringing to the table here. Is look beyond the actual dinner experience. Look beyond the actual, putting the earphones on and you're listening to music with a set of Bose headphones or Beats or different pieces. Look beyond that actual experience of using an interface on your web browser to the anticipatory part and the remembered part.
That's fantastic. I'm going to steal a line that you've used in the past about curating the elements, right, that are available to us, and then taking what you just said, expanding that beyond just what is the experience when we're in the app. Okay, so I'm open up an app, and a user designer might be thinking, okay, so how do we get them to go from A to B and then from B to C, and how can we reduce friction? And those are good questions to ask. They're just not the whole story. And what Jonathan reminds us of is it's a bigger picture. What kind of baggage are they bringing to the table when they come to the app? When they open the app, where are they coming from? Yeah. Right. And then where are they going afterwards? What's the remembered self?
Yeah, which gets into Cialdini's persuasion, right? Absolutely. It's this idea that, and priming in general, what comes in advance can influence what comes after. So you go, well, the anticipatory, that's one thing, but you can actually change how people experience an experience.
Yeah.
I like tongue twister there. But this idea that you can prime people to be more appreciative of it, or to notice certain aspects of it, or as in the German or French music playing in a wine shop, actually influence the behaviors that happen within that moment or that experience. So those are all really key things to be thinking about, and as a designer taking into consideration. So again, it's that curating of the elements that go into an experience, all of that experience, if you think about it from Jonathan's perspective, which is way before to way after the actual experience itself.
Absolutely. You bring up Cialdini, and I'm so glad you did, because that was really fun to hear about Jonathan's experience with him, and how he talks. He even said, to my delight, Cialdini writes back. And the next day I took him to lunch. It's like, yeah, he's a real human being. He's not just an icon, which I thought was pretty cool. But bringing up all those things was really important. And it brought me back to an experience that I had in the Sequoia National Forest, where I saw some signs that said we are losing our precious resources to people who steal pine cones from the forest floor. So please don't steal pine cones. And And Bob Cialdini actually did a study with the Petrified Forest on this very same issue, where they had these signs that said, don't be like other people who steal the rocks, because this is the museum. Basically, this is the forest itself. So don't do this. And it was horrible, right? Because they just thought by calling out the bad behavior that they would stop people from doing it. But it wasn't until they changed the messaging to like 99% of all visitors don't steal petrified wood did people actually start to reduce their stealing. And I wish they would do that in other national forests, like the Sequoia National Forest. It's like they could have learned. They could have learned from their national forest buddies. I don't know.
Well, and what's interesting about that, and Cialdini talks about this, is look, you are doing a couple different things by saying, hey, all these people, all these other people are doing it. It's a social proof statement. It also is a scarcity aspect. Well, I better get my pine cone now because they're all going to be gone when I come back, because all these other idiots are doing it. So I'm going to get mine, versus, doing the alternative of saying, hey, that your pine cone, that you are going to be like the rest of everybody else. The social proof is actually on the numbers
positive
of people
side
who are doing the right thing, which is, and actually the fact of the matter is yeah, pine cones might have been stolen, but the vast majority of people that go to Sequoia National Park don't take the pine cones. It's a select few.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, those are the interesting pieces. And this is where behavioral science, I think, can be very impactful across a number of just different situations, right? It's not just in consumer behavior at the supermarket. It's not just in employee engagement initiatives. It is in our national park services. It's in government issue elements. It's across the board, because it's all about human behavior. And that's really leads a major portion of, or fills a major portion of our waking lives. Actually,
Absolutely.
Every single moment of our waking lives.
Constantly, consciously or unconsciously. It's all there. Kurt, what else did you want to groove on?
Well, I think the big piece is, and Jonathan brought this up, right? How do you know if an intervention that you're doing that is applying some of these behavioral science principles is an ethical intervention? And that's something that we've explored a ton, but I really like Jonathan had a really clear look. 3 rules to consider. One, is it true? So is it verifiable? Is it factual? And he took these from Cialdini. But is it true? So if you say that the vast majority of people aren't taking pine cones, if that's not true, if more than 50% of people are actually picking up a pine cone, then you can't state that, right? That isn't a factual statement. So don't make shit up, right? Would you mind? And then the second rule is, would you mind if it were done to you?
Yeah, the golden rule thing. Yeah,
the golden rule. And then the third part is, it really in the best interest of the other party? And he is talking about his work with PayPal and various different pieces. And yeah, so if people did this behavior that they want them to do, not only does it serve the company well, but you can actually point to a benefit that it does have for the people signing up on that.
Yeah, and there is this kind of gets into nudges a little bit. We have talked a little bit about the idea that to some degree nudges can be moralizing. There can be a moral context to nudges and things like this. I don't know how we escape that, really. But that's just the way it is. I would also want to add, we could add in one of Scott Jeffrey's great ethical rules, which, would you mind if what you're doing ends up on the front page of the New York Times?
Yeah, that's that kind of my oh crap, moment, right? Is it an oh crap moment that this was put on the front page of the New York Times, or is it a oh wow moment of having on the front? It's like, yes, we're on the front page of the New York Times. Isn't this awesome? Which is one that we've used that as part of looking at some incentives. And when you think and talking with executives about incentive design in some of the work that I've done, that's the question that gets asked. Particularly, there's been a lot of focus in on group travel and these high-end rewards and various different pieces. And they're going, well, how would that look if it was, hey, company X, sent 300 of its top performers to Hawaii at a cost of X thousands of dollars? Does that look good, neutral, or negative if it was put on the front page of the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal?
Well, and the fact that you and I have both had clients that when they did those trips, they chose not to have any signage that advertised their company name, that it was very discreet about what company was putting these events on. And I think it, to some degree right there, where they're sort of signaling, we don't want this on the front page of the New York Times.
Yeah, but you can then look at the alternative and go, how it gets framed can make a big difference. And so again, that front page New York article could be framed from an incentive perspective, big pharma spending your hard-earned, or charging exorbitant prices for their drugs to send, people to Hawaii to party. Yeah. Or it could be framed in another way of saying, hard work pays off with big rewards for, people, making a difference in the world of pharma.
Yeah. Or another headline could be top performers are rewarded in order to continue to engage them to do great work.
Yeah. So all three of those, they're going to have a different piece, which is maybe not so good about thinking about the headline on the front page of the New York Times as a good arbitrator, because you could think of the different ways that could be framed. But those are the pieces. So going back to the experience, right? What is the anticipatory component of that? What is the actual component of it? And what is the remembered component of it?
Excellent. That's fantastic. Okay. Hang on, Groovers. We're going to have a bonus track coming up in just a second.
And listen to the great music that is going on in between here.
Hey Groovers, this is Tim with the bonus track and groove idea for the week. In our conversation with Jonathan, he asked us to consider something wonderfully philosophic. Can one human create an experience for another human? Disney hires what they call Imagineers, but not experienciers for good reason. It's very difficult to imagine actually creating an experience for someone else. Jonathan brought the importance of the anticipation of the experience itself, and the memory of the experience as the three legs to the experiential tool. It makes sense to us. We know that the remembered self is one of the most important reasons that we do anything. How we'll remember it is important. He also brought up his meeting with Bob Cialdini, which we loved, and how Jonathan's work with Bob's crew brought powerful results to the initiatives they were working on at PayPal. It's always cool for Kurt and me to hear how nicely behavioral science and business results dovetail. And lastly, we got to hear Jonathan play guitar. His fingerstyle abilities are very fine, and that the part of the conversation really enriched my heart. It still does when I listen to the very bright tones of his instrument and how they flow into the microphone. It was really wonderful stuff. For your groove idea for the week, Kurt and I would like to ask you to be aware of your decision making and to what degree your anticipated memories influence your choices. In other words, try to catch yourself wondering whether a decision you're going to make today will influence what will make you feel a certain way in the future. Will looking back on your decision make you feel good or bad? And how does that influence the way you decide right now? Well, that's it for another episode of Behavioral Grooves. Thanks for listening, and we hope that this week you go out and find your groove.